Welcome to our video exploring the fascinating intersection of faith, reason, and revelation. Today, we delve into a topic that has intrigued scholars, skeptics, and seekers for centuries: the existence of God and the enigmatic numerical miracles found lately within the Quran. As humanity grapples with profound questions about the nature of existence, the universe, and our place within it, we turn to the Quran, the central religious text of Islam, which many believe holds not only spiritual guidance but also profound mathematical patterns that defy explanation by human intellect alone. Join us on a journey of discovery as we explore the fascinating evidence that some argue points towards a divine authorship behind the Quran, offering compelling insights into the existence of God. Before we delve into the topic of numerical miracles in the Quran, we need to go back in history to see how God has acted through history with different peoples and their messengers, what was relevant in their times, and how God confronted what was popular among the people to whom he sent a messenger. During the time of Abraham, worshipping fire was popular. King Nimrod ordered the worship of fire. God granted Abraham a miracle with fire. When he was thrown into the fire, it did not burn him. During the time of Joseph, dream interpretation was popular, and God gave him the ability to interpret dreams perfectly. During the time of Prophet Saleh, carving houses in mountains and rocks was popular, and God granted him the miracle of bringing a living camel out of a split rock. During the time of Moses, black magic and sorcery were popular, and God granted him miracles in the field of magic, such as turning his staff into a snake, parting the sea, turning his hand white, and turning the Nile River into blood. During the time of Prophet Jesus, medicine was popular, and God granted him miracles in the field of medicine, such as being born without a father, giving life to the dead, healing the blind and the sick with a touch, and giving life to shaped clay birds. During the time of Muhammad, poetry was popular among Arabs, and God gave the Quran as a challenge to poetry, asserting that no one from the Arabs could match its linguistic style. Now that we know all of this, the question arises: what is God's challenge to our generation today? Considering that God presents challenges to all nations based on what was popular at that time, and since the Quran is a book intended for future generations, including our own, what is currently popular that God might challenge us with? Could it be science, technological achievements, space exploration, spaceships, telescopes, mathematics, and so on? Indeed, in this realm, God provides miracles in the Quran, scientific and mathematical miracles, that challenge modern science today.
Dear friends, what we are going to present to you in this video is something extraordinary, something which has not been presented before on this magnitude on YouTube. Super intelligent mathematics in the Quran, which is clear and testable evidence that the Quran could only come from an all-knowing God, and that also serves as strong proof for the existence of God. Such numerical structure found in the Quran has never been observed anywhere before in any literature in human history. Most massive numerical miracle in the Quran, extracted from only 2 columns, chapter numbers and verse numbers.
What is amazing about the Quran is that it provides evidence of its divine origin, and you don't even need to know or read a single word from the Quran. This is because you can simply analyze the symmetry in the structure of the chapter and verse numbers in the Quran to realize that this book could not have been authored by humans in the 7th century. Especially when you consider how the chapters and verses were revealed to Muhammad. Various events occurred during the Prophet Muhammad's life that initiated God to send verses or entire chapters addressing different topics in the lives of Muslims and non-Muslims. For example, if there was an issue between a husband and wife, and the wife sought advice from Prophet Muhammad, revelation would begin to come to him regarding that specific event. Muhammad could not have composed the Quran independently because it was the events that shaped the revelation of the Quran. Muhammad could only instruct his scribes, as he was illiterate, to write certain verses in specific places in the Quran, all according to the revelation. The Quran was not arranged in chronological order 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., because Muhammad did not have knowledge of the future to plan such an order. If someone were to argue that Muhammad and his scribes organized the Quran in such an amazing manner, it would be impossible because it was the events of the 7th century that influenced the structure of the Quran. We begin by putting a column of chapter numbers and a column of verse numbers. By adding the chapter number with the verse number, we get a third column. In the third column, odd numbers are displayed in purple while even numbers are displayed in green. Because the columns are large, ranging from 1 to 114, we cannot show you the entire columns. Therefore, we have decided not to display the middle part in order to fit the columns into one image. Now we create two columns, one with even green numbers and the other with odd purple numbers. We observe the first pattern. We have 57 odd numbers and 57 even numbers. The second pattern is that the sum of all chapter numbers, which is 6,555, is equal to the sum of all odd purple totals, which is also 6,555, while the sum of all verse numbers, 6236, is equal to the sum of all even green totals, 6236. We continue to analyze the pattern further, which can be extracted from the first two columns. If we create a column with chapters with even totals and a column with verses with odd totals, we obtain the following results. The sum of all chapters with even number totals is 3,303, which is equal to the sum of all verses with odd number totals, also 3,303. Now let's create two more columns, one with chapter numbers from the last half that have even verses, and the other with even verses from the first half. The result is that the sum of all chapter numbers from the last half, which have even verses, is 2690, while the sum of all even verses from the first half of the column is also 2690. This is truly a remarkable and obviously intentional numerical pattern we see here. Numerical patterns do not end there. We now analyze odd purple totals and even green totals. We observe that some numbers are repeated in that column while others are not. For example, chapter 104 and chapter 110 have the same total, which is 113, fitting into the category of repetitive numbers. On the other hand, the first four chapters have non-repetitive totals. For example, the total number of the first chapter, 8, does not repeat anywhere else in the column. So, we summarize all repetitive numbers, which is 7,906, and summarize all non-repetitive numbers, which is 4,885. Then, we divide the sum of all repetitive numbers by the sum of all non-repetitive numbers, and we get 1.618, which is the golden ratio. The golden ratio in science is referred to as the divine proportion because it is found everywhere in nature, from the shape of galaxies, hurricanes, nautilus shells, DNA, animals, plants, and humans. The golden ratio is like God's seal on His creation, as if to say, "This is my creation." Since we see that God created many things in the golden ratio, it's no wonder that He adorned His book, the Quran, with the golden ratio as well, thereby showing people that the Quran is a book from the same Creator as our galaxy and all other creations. Numerical patterns with chapter numbers and verse numbers from the Quran are even more complex than you can imagine. The complexity found in only chapter numbers and verse numbers is far greater than you can comprehend at the moment. Also, remember that this book came in 7th century Arabia to an illiterate prophet, Prophet Muhammad, when there was no science or technological advancement. The majority of the people in 7th century Arabia could not even read or write. Now, let's have a look at what we can extract further from chapter numbers and verse numbers, based on 4 different categories: columns for odd odd, odd even odd, and even columns. For example, the first chapter has 7 verses, which means chapter 1 has 7 verses, fitting into the odd column. We begin with the first example. We observe that the symmetrical distribution sections, odd even, odd even, and even odd, are 27, 30, 30, 27, which is symmetrical. If it were like this, 27, 29, 31, 27, then it would not be symmetrical anymore.
Our next numerical pattern is based on homogeneous and non-homogeneous sections, which are divided in the middle. Homogeneous sections contain odd and even chapters and verses. For example, chapter 1 has 7 verses, which is odd and belongs to the homogeneous section. The non-homogeneous section contains odd and odd chapters and verses. The result is that the first part of the Quran has a distribution of 28 and 29, while the second part of the Quran has a distribution of 29 and 28. which is symmetrical distribution. Here we see that without cutting in the middle, both homogeneous and non-homogeneous sections have 57 each, which is symmetrical. Now, let us divide the numbers contained in the index of Quran, according to their homogeneity with respect to divisible by 2 and being not divisible by 3. Example for chapter with homogeneous chapter numbers and number of verses. Second chapter Baqarah has 286 verses. Is homogeneous chapter. Both chapter number and number of verses meets the condition of divisible by 2 and being not divisible by 3. Therefore, this chapter is homogeneous in this respect. First chapter Fatiha has 7 verses, is also a homogeneous chapter. Example for chapter of which their chapter number and number of verses are not homogeneous. 8th chapter Al-Anfal has 75 verses. Chapter number 8 meets the condition of divisible by 2 and being not divisible by 3, whereas number of verses 75 does not cover this condition. Therefore this chapter is no homogeneous in this respect. 7th chapter Al-Araf has 206 verses. Number of verses meets the condition of divisible by 2 and being not divisible by 3, whereas its chapter number 7 does not cover this condition. Therefore Al-Araf is not homogeneous in this respect. Columns homogeneous and non-homogeneous cut in half, divisible by 2 and not divisible by 3, are as follows. First half 33, 24, second half 33, 24, which is a symmetrical distribution. Now let us analyze what happens if we apply divisible by 3 and not divisible by 2. The result is as follows. First half 42, 15, second half 42, 15, which is a symmetrical distribution. Now let us analyze what happens if we apply neither divisible by 2 and nor by 3. The result is as follows. First half 29, 28, second half 28, 29, which is a symmetrical distribution. This time we create two different types of columns. One column is called odd sequence numbers used in number of verses, and the other column is called even sequence numbers used in number of verses. An example of odd sequence numbers used in the number of verses is chapter 3, which has a connection to chapter 108 since it has only 3 verses, matching chapter 3 with the 3 verses of chapter 108. An example of even sequence numbers used in the number of verses is chapter 8, which has a connection to chapter 98 since chapter 98 has 8 verses. The result is as follows. There are a total of 32 odd sequence numbers used in the number of verses and a total of 32 even sequence numbers used in the number of verses, which is symmetrical distribution. This time we create two different types of columns. One column is called odd sequence numbers, not used in number of verses, and the other column is called even sequence numbers, not used in number of verses. An example of odd sequence numbers not used in the number of verses is chapter 1. Since there are no chapters in the Quran with one verse, then it fits into section odd sequence numbers, not used in number of verses. The result is as follows. There are a total of 25 odd sequence numbers, not used in the number of verses, and a total of 25 even sequence numbers not used in the number of verses, which is symmetrical distribution. Now we create two sections with two columns each. One section is called number of verses greater than chapter number, with columns odd number difference and even number difference. The other section is called number of verses greater than chapter number, with columns odd sequence number and even sequence number. We take, for example, chapter Fatiha, which is chapter 1 and has 7 verses. Because the number 7 is greater than the number 1, it fits into the column even number difference, which is 6. The result is as follows. There are a total of 23, 25, 25, 23, which is a symmetrical distribution. This time we create two sections with two columns each. One section is called number of verses smaller than chapter number, with columns odd number difference and even number difference. The other section is called number of verses smaller than chapter number, with columns odd sequence number and even sequence number. Example, Surah Sada is chapter 32, has 30 verses. Because chapter number 32 is bigger than the verse number 30, it fits in section number of verses smaller than sequence number. Even number difference is 2, because 32 minus 30 is equal to. The result is as follows. There are a total of 34, 32, 32, 34, which is a symmetrical distribution. After we have detected this huge and complex numerical pattern embedded in the distribution of chapter numbers and verse numbers in the Quran, the question now arises, what would happen to the Quranic structure if we were to add or remove only one verse in the Quran? What would happen even if we transferred one verse from one chapter to another? The answer is that the symmetry would break apart, and we would not have such symmetries as presented in the previous examples. This tells us mathematically that the Quran is an unchanged book from God since the time of revelation. No human in the 7th century could create such a complex symmetrical structure in a book. If nothing else is found in the Quran, this is enough as proof that this book comes from God just as it claims. It also proves the verse from the Quran where God says, "Indeed, it is we who sent down the Quran, and indeed, we will be its guardian." Chapter 15 verse 9. For example, if we were to add one verse to chapter 106, so instead of having 4 verses, it now has 5 verses. We can clearly see in the sums at the bottom of the columns how the symmetry is destroyed, and nothing matches anymore. We get numbers such as 6,555, 6,237, 6,126, 6,666, 3,197, 3,308, which is clear mathematical proof that any distortion of the original Quranic order would destroy the symmetry in the Quran. This massive numerical structure in the Quran is clear proof for all humans on earth that the Quran is not an ordinary book. It has divine origin, coming from the same creator who mathematically constructed our universe and the nature on earth.
Miracles in the Quran with word counts.
Before we delve into the topic of word counts in the Quran, we first need to understand how the Quran was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad and the circumstances during the period of revelation. This understanding will help us better comprehend and appreciate the numerical miracles of the Quran, as it could not have been constructed by humans or Muhammad himself. Rather, it is a direct revelation from the all-knowing God, who constructed the mathematical universe. Hence it's not surprising that he would also mathematically construct his book, the Quran. First we need to understand how the revelation from God came down to Muhammad. Zayd bin Thabit, one of the chief scribes, relates, "I used to write down revelation for the Holy Prophet. May the peace and blessings of God be upon him. When the revelation came to him he felt intense heat, and drops of perspiration used to roll down his body like pearls. When this state was over I used to fetch a shoulder bone, or piece of something else. He used to go on dictating and I used to write it down. When I finished writing, the sheer weight of transcription gave me the feeling that my leg would break, and I would not be able to walk any more. Anyhow, when I finished writing, he would say, 'Read,' and I would read it back to him. If there was an omission or error, he used to correct it, and then let it be brought before the people." This hadith is narrated by Tabarani. During Prophet Muhammad's time, the Quran was written on different materials such as animal bones, stones, dried animal skin, wood, etc. Then, we need to understand it from Muhammad's perspective. Firstly, he was an illiterate person who could neither read nor write. Secondly, in the 7th century, they didn't have computers, calculus, enough paper, or search programs. They had to rely solely on their minds. Thirdly, another crucial aspect to mention is Muhammad's difficult situation during the revelation period. He was beaten, humiliated, lived under economic sanctions, experienced hunger, fear, and sorrow due to the death of family members, and faced war because idolaters attacked him numerous times. Imagine being in a war zone and trying to recite a book claiming it is from God. Who would think about numerical codings in such circumstances? You're fighting, hearing bullets and grenades flying around you, and now you're going to recite a text that will be numerically coded. That is highly unlikely. It is unreasonable to think any human person could do that just in their mind considering the situation. Fourthly, many numerical miracles involve knowing chapter numbers and verse numbers. During the revelation time, there were no numbering systems for chapters and verses. Endings of verses were indicated by symbols or decorations. So, you couldn't refer to verse 34 or 57, for example. The numbering of verses came long after the revelation of the Quran was completed, and it was done to make it easier for us to refer to certain verses, using numbers instead of explaining to people, in the verse which says this and that. Now, imagine not having numbered verses. It would be extremely difficult for a person to numerically code a text without knowing verse numbers. It would be a real nightmare to try to program it. The fact that verses were not numbered during Prophet Muhammad's time is evidence that the numerical coding of the Quran comes from God. There were layers upon layers of difficulties in attempting something like the Quran when considering all the challenges mentioned above. Let us look at some examples of meaningful word counts. For example, the word day, in the non-specific singular form, is mentioned 365 times in the Quran, just like there are 365 days in one solar year. The word day, in the plural form, appears 30 times. just like the 30 days of a month. The word month in the singular form occurs 12 times, just like the 12 months in a year. The word months in the plural form appears 9 times, just like the 9-month pregnancy period. The word year in the singular form is mentioned 7 times, like the 7 leap years in the Metonic cycle. The word years in the plural form appears 12 times, like the 12 leap years in the Metonic cycle, totaling 19 times, just like there are 19 years in a Metonic cycle. The Metonic cycle is when the sun, moon, and earth come into the same position every 19 years. Now, let's take a look at the antonyms word counts in the Quran. God hints at odd and even in verse 89:3, by the even and the odd. We can observe how opposite words are mentioned the same number of times in the Quran, such as angels and devil, each appearing 88 times. This world and the next world are mentioned 115 times each. Allah loves and Allah loves not are each mentioned 17 times. Belief and disbelief appear 25 times each. Near and apart are mentioned 10 times each. Benefit and harm occur 9 times each. Heat and coolness are mentioned 4 times each. Man and woman appear 24 times each. Marriage and to marry are mentioned 23 times each. Divorce and to divorce also appear 23 times each. Summer and winter are mentioned once each. People of understanding and craziness are each mentioned 16 times. East and sunrise are mentioned 16 times, while west and sunset are mentioned 16 times. Love and hate appear 17 times. Obedience and disobedience are mentioned 3 times. Morning and evening are each mentioned 7 times. Sleep, dream, and vision are each mentioned 7 times. Old man and old woman are mentioned 4 times each, and child, which is the opposite of old people, is also mentioned 4 times. Similar words or words, which have connections with each other counting. Sun, 33 times. Light, singular, 33 times. Wine, 6 times. Drunk, drunkenness, 6 times. Preach, 25 times. Tongue, language, 25 times. That day, referring to Judgment Day, 70 times. Judgment Day, 70 times. Messenger and all its derivatives, 513 times. All names of messengers, Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, David, Jacob until Muhammad, 513 times. Prophet, Arabic Nabi, bearer of good news, 80 times. News, Arabic Naba, same root as for prophet, 80 times. Verse which connects them, 213. Mankind was single community. Then God sent prophets to bring good news and warning. Phrase 7 heavens, universes, 7 times. The creation of heavens, universes, 7 times. Say, 332 times. They said, 332 times. War, 4 times. Prisoner of war, 4 times. Spoils of war, 4 times. The kingdom, 20 times. The throne, 20 times. Bee, 1 time. Honey, 1 time. Glorification, 2 times. Those who glorify, 2 times. Words which are connected by a verse. Adam, 25 times. Jesus, 25 times. Verse which connects them. 359. For God the likeness of Jesus is as that of Adam whom he fashioned out of dust and said be and he was. Iblis is name of greatest Satan. Iblis, 11 times. Seeking refuge, 11 times. Verse which connects them. 41:36. If the Satan incite you to evil, seek refuge in God. He is all hearing and all knowing. Dog, 5 times. People who deny our signs, 5 times. Verse which connects them. 7:176. His likeness is that of a dog, who hangs out his tongue if you drive him away, and still hangs it out if you leave him alone. Such is the case of the people who deny our signs. Narrate this history to them, they may haply reflect. Donkey, 2 times. Carrying, the Torah, 2 times. Verse which connects these examples. 62:5. The parable of those entrusted to carry the Torah, who subsequently do not carry it out in practice, is that of a donkey carrying a load of books. How evil is the example of those who deny God's revelations. God does not guide the wrongdoing people. Spider, 2 times. Those whom they had taken, protectors, besides Allah, 2 times. Those whom they had taken, protectors, besides him, 2 times. Verse which connects these examples. 29:41. The likeness of those whom they had taken besides Allah, protectors is as the likeness of a spider, that takes to himself a house, and, verily, the weakest of houses is a spider's house, if they did but know. Paradise, garden, singular, 70 times. That day, 70 times. Judgment Day 70 times. Verse which connect paradise and that day. 25, 24. Owners of the garden, paradise, on that day, will be better in their abode, and have the best place of repose. Hell, Jahannam, 77 times. Paradises, gardens, plural, 77 times. If someone doubts these findings, even though multiple researchers have worked on them for more than 10 years, there may be some skeptics who doubt these findings. But let us remove the doubt now with just one example, which is maybe the most debated among atheists, Christians, and Muslims. The word day is mentioned in the Quran 365 times in non-specific singular form. As you can see in the image, all forms of the word day are presented here, and you can check for yourself the list presented here with every occurrence of the word day in non-specific singular form. Arabic, yum. This finding is confirmed by multiple researchers, and it is obvious what is hinted at with the word day appearing a total of 365 times in the Quran, that is, 365 days in a solar year.
Numbers and verse text imitate surroundings, much like an octopus imitates its surroundings to camouflage itself.
One of the interesting features of the Quran is the verses that mimic their surroundings with their verse numbers or verse text, much like when an octopus mimics its environment with camouflage to hide from predators or prey, as you can see in this video. It is not known in the history of literature for authors to construct their books so that parts of the text mimic the environment in some way. We can begin with the longest chapter in the Quran, which is chapter Baqarah. It has 286 verses. In the middle of this chapter, in verse 143, we see the word middle. In this way, this verse mimics its place in the longest chapter in the Quran, at the midpoint. Even though the verse talks about something else, the title, Middle Nation, refers to the Muslim nation. God tells us in the Quran that He made the Muslim nation to neither take the religion of Islam to the extreme nor to be too soft, but to follow a middle way. Another example of when the verse number mirrors the context is verse 36, showing the number 36 in pairs. The only mention of pairs in this chapter, which is 83 verses long, is found solely in verse 36. Thus, in this way, the linguistic aspect, using the word pairs, matches the numerical aspect, with the double occurrence of 36 in the verse number. Verse 1881 mentions the word change, while we observe how the digits 1 and 8 change places in the verse number. Out of 6,236 verses in the Quran, God mentions equal age between husband and wife in paradise. In paradise, nobody is single, all men and women are married. God says in this verse that these beautiful women in paradise will be married to men of equal age. Prophet Muhammad said in his hadith that people in paradise will be 33 years of age and stay forever young, never getting sick, old, or dying there. What is interesting here is that this verse, which talks about equal age between husband and wife in paradise, is verse 33. In this way, the verse number mirrors the age of 33, which people in paradise will be.
The numerical connection between verse 313, which talks about the Battle of Badr, and the 313 Muslim soldiers in that battle is evident. Here we clearly see how the verse number 313 is numerically connected to the first battle of Muslim soldiers with Prophet Muhammad against the polytheists, where there were a total of 313 Muslim soldiers.
This example, which we are presenting here now, is truly remarkable, a true miracle from God to all humans. It's easy to understand and impossible to imitate. The word cubits is mentioned only here in this verse, and nowhere else in the entire Quran. God tells us that the people of hell will be bound in long chains, which are 70 cubits long. A cubit is an arm's length, and that is the only unit of measurement mentioned in the entire Quran. The verse is 32. Now, if we convert 70 cubits to meters, we see that it is exactly 32 meters. Meters did not exist in the 7th century, because they were defined for the first time in the year 1791 by the French Academy of Sciences. The miracle does not end there. From the beginning of the verse to the 70 cubits, Arabic letters in the original text of the Quran have a numerical value exactly 1791, just like the year when the meter was defined in France. So God has basically encoded the future measurement, which will be called meters, and the year when it will be defined. This is clear evidence that the Quran comes from God, since no human knows the future. Since this definition of the meter occurs more than 1,000 years after the revelation of the Quran, this is obvious proof that the Quran comes from an all-knowing God who knows the future, and what people will invent. I'm sure your mind is blown away now by how amazing this is, but that's not all. The miracle doesn't end there. The miracle is even bigger than that. This verse, 32, which mentions cubits, has a numerical value of 3,153. If we convert 3,153 cubits into meters, we get 1,441.5. Now, if we look at verse 1441, we see that the verse is exactly the 1,791st verse of the Quran, which is the year when meters were defined, and we could convert cubits into meters for the first time. You can see this with your own eyes, how the year 1791 is encoded in the original text of the Quran in Arabic. This is clear visual proof for all of you that the author of the Quran knows the future, since he can encode the text like this to match the exact year, when meters shall be defined, and it will be possible to convert 70 cubits into 32 meters. Since the Arabic letters have numerical values ranging from 1, which is the first letter, Aleph, to letter G, Arabic, Gain, which has numerical value 1000, it is extremely difficult to hit on a specific number with meaningful text, like the large number 1791 in this case.
Verse numbers which imitate the text of the verse and its future scientific fact.
Now that we're familiar with how Quranic verse numbers mimic the environment on a simple level, let's now look at what it looks like when it's not obvious without science and modern technology. When Quranic verse numbers mimic the text on a more complex level, here we have to analyze modern science to understand the connection between the verse number and the verse text.
God says in the Quran in the chapter Prophets, verse 32, "And we made the sky a protected roof, but they, from its signs, are turning away."
There is only one verse in the entire Quran, which talks about the protective characteristics of the sky, mentioning that it protects us from something. This verse is verse 32 in the chapter of Prophets. Now science tells us that the peak of the ozone layer is at an altitude of 32 kilometers, matching the number of the verse, 32. To even mention that the blue sky protects us from anything is a miracle in itself, because nobody could detect anything in the sky with their eyes in the 7th century that it protects us. From previous simple examples, we can conclude that even this verse number mimics the text of the verse, with the peak of the ozone layer at 32 kilometers altitude, which protects us from harmful radiation from the sun. Remember also that kilometers were not yet invented during the revelation of the Quran. They were defined 1,000 years after the revelation of the Quran.
God says in the Quran in the chapter 55, verse 33, "O company of jinn and men, if you are able to penetrate beyond realms of the heavens and the earth, then penetrate. You cannot penetrate without power."
This is the only verse in the Quran that speaks of the possibility for people to go into space, where they need a lot of power, and we know that it requires a lot of fuel. The verse is 33, to escape Earth's gravity and enter Earth orbit. We need to reach a speed greater than the speed of sound, meaning the speed must be 33 times greater than the speed of sound. This is called Mach 33. Here we clearly see how the verse number aligns with the speed required to go into space. That is Mach 33. The miracle does not end there. The Quran has 6,236 verses. This verse is the 4,934th in the Quran, and it contains 16 words. If we add these numbers, 6,236 plus 4,934 plus 16, the total is 11,186, which is the escape velocity from Earth's gravity, measured at 11,186 meters per second.
When we search for the letters DNA in the Quran, we find them most frequently in one verse out of 6,236 verses, occurring 3 times. That verse is 1865. The letters DNA occur in existing Arabic words, just as we would use known words today like Edna or Ednabel, which contain the letters DNA in the correct order. History tells us that the science of genetics officially began in the year 1865 with Gregor Mendel, matching the verse number 1865. These 3 occurrences of DNA in the verse are placed at correct distances to visually represent how DNA major and minor grooves look. The ratio between the major and minor groove is 1.6 to 1, both in the Quran and in reality, which is the golden ratio number. Even a doctor, Rocky Terminini, wrote about this example from the Quran in his book about DNA titled Storing Digital Binary Data in Cellular DNA on page 430. If we search for the neutron in the Quran, we find the consonant letters N, T, R, N in the correct order at one place only in the Quran out of 6236 verses. That verse is 1839. Science tells us today that the neutron is heavier 1839 times than an electron, which is a constant number. This number 1839 is always rounded up in science books. The exact number is 1838.65. What we can observe from the Quran is that the letters for neutron appear in the 18th chapter, after 38 verses, after 65% of the verse 1839, in such a way coding the neutron at a precise number with 2 decimals, 6 and 5. Numerical patterns with initial letters at the beginnings of chapters in the Quran.
Some chapters of the Quran begin with initial letters, like Aleph, Lam, Mim. It is as if we were to write a L, M at the beginning of a chapter before we start writing something. Chapter 68 begins with the letter N. God says in the first verse of this chapter, N, by the pen and by what they write. We see that the letter N in the Arabic alphabet has a numerical value of 50. This letter N occurs in this chapter exactly in 50 verses out of 52, matching the numerical value of the letter N. The verse is usually written like this, 68, 1. This letter N occurs exactly in 681 verses after this verse to the end of the Quran, matching the verse number 68, 1. Keeping track of a single letter, and where it occurs in so many verses is truly astonishing. No humans could do that when they write books, and for humans, this is hard to do and trivial in their literature. But for the all-knowing God, it is easy, and that is why he did it as evidence that the book comes from him. God says in the Quran, verse 78, 29, we have kept account of everything in a book. God says in beginning of chapter 27, verse 1, T.S. These are signs of the Quran and a clear book. Chapter is 27, it has 93 verses. Letter T occurs 27 times in this chapter just like the chapter number 27, while letter S occur 93 times just like there are 93 verses in this chapter. The verse 27:01 says that these letters are signs, some kind of miracles for us when we connect chapter 27 and chapter 93, because chapter 27 has 93 verses, and count all T and S letters from the beginning of chapter 27, which is verse 27:01, to the end of chapter 93. We get a total of 2,701 letters scattered throughout 67 chapters, matching the number of the first verse 27:01, equaling 2,701, where T and S letters are said to be signs in the Quran. Chapter 20 begins with initial letters T, H, Arabic, Taha. The first verse of this chapter is composed of these 2 letters, T and H. In this chapter, the letters T and H appear together 20 verses, while before this chapter they appear connected also in only 20 verses out of 2,348 verses before chapter 20. That they occur in 20 verses out of 2,348 verses is a clear indication that the chapter number 20 is hinted here, where the letters T and H appear as initial letters.
Ratio 1.618 in the Quran.
The golden ratio, often represented by the Greek letter phi, is a mathematical concept that has fascinated mathematicians, artists, architects, and thinkers for centuries. At its core, the golden ratio represents a special relationship between 2 quantities, where the ratio of the sum of the quantities to the larger quantity is equal to the ratio of the larger quantity to the smaller one. This ratio appears in various forms throughout nature, art, architecture, and even in the human body. It's often associated with aesthetic beauty and harmony, leading many to consider it a fundamental principle of design and proportion. The golden ratio has a rich history, dating back to ancient civilizations such as the Greeks and Egyptians, who believed it held mystical and aesthetic significance. Throughout history, it has been used in architecture, art, and design, from the Parthenon in Athens to Leonardo da Vinci's Vitruvian Man in modern times. The golden ratio continues to captivate the imagination of mathematicians and artists alike. Its presence in nature, art, and design serves as a reminder of the interconnectedness of mathematics in the world around us, inspiring creativity and exploration across various disciplines. In this video, we embark on a fascinating journey into the depths of mathematics, spirituality, and the profound mysteries of the universe. For centuries, scholars and believers have marveled at the beauty and complexity of the Quran, seeing within its verses a reflection of divine wisdom and guidance. Now, we delve into a lesser-known aspect of this ancient scripture, one that intertwines the realms of mathematics and spirituality in a stunning display of harmony and precision. The golden ratio, a mathematical proportion revered for its aesthetic elegance, and found abundantly in nature, has long captivated the minds of mathematicians, artists, and architects. But what if I told you that this divine proportion is not only present in the natural world, but also encoded within the very fabric of the Quran itself? Throughout this video, we will unveil the hidden mathematical patterns within the Quran, focusing specifically on the presence of the golden ratio as evidence of a divine design. We will explore how these intricate mathematical structures serve as compelling testimony to the Quran's divine origin, providing believers with a deeper understanding of the Quran's timeless message and reinforcing their faith in its divine authorship. Join us as we unravel the mysteries of the golden ratio in the Quran, and witness firsthand the profound implications of this discovery on our understanding of God's design in the world around us. Prepare to be amazed as we uncover the mathematical marvels hidden within the sacred pages of the Quran, reaffirming the belief that it is indeed the Word of God, intricately woven with signs of His wisdom and guidance. When we look in the Quran search programs, we see that the Quran has a total of 77,432 words. Then, we decided to divide this number by the golden ratio, 1.618. We found that the word number is 47,857, which corresponds to the golden ratio word. When we search in the Quran to find which verse this word belongs to, we discover it is 26,123, and that verse has a numerical value exactly 1,618, which is truly extraordinary. The fact that the golden ratio, based on the total number of words in the Quran, appears in a verse with a numerical value of 1,618 is truly astonishing. Let us show you this numerical miracle in the Quran directly, in Quran search program, called Quran Code. Here you see that the last word in the Quran is the 77,432nd word. With this number, we divide by the golden ratio, 1.618, to see in which verse the golden ratio word is located. That word is the 47,857th word, which is located in the verse with the numerical value 1,618. If we want to see where the golden ratio, based on the total number of chapters in the Quran, is located, we divide 1.618 by 114, which is the total number of chapters in the Quran. We get 70.457, which rounds up to the 71st chapter in the Quran. When we look for the chapter, Ornament of Gold, it is located at the golden ratio position next to the 71st chapter, from the end of the Quran, which is the 43rd chapter. This means that the author of the Quran connected the golden ratio to the metal gold for the first time, long before the German mathematician invented the term golden ratio. Now let us dive deep into the chapter, Ornaments of Gold, to see if the golden ratio is coded in the only chapter in the Quran which has a linguistic connection to the golden ratio, since the chapter, Zuruf, in Arabic means ornament of gold. This chapter has 89 verses. If we divide this number by the golden ratio, 1.618, we find that the 55th verse from the end of the chapter is verse 35, and that is the only verse which mentions the Arabic word Zuruf, meaning ornaments of gold. Another example where the author connects the golden ratio to gold. The golden ratio is even coded based on the total number of letters in this chapter, which is 3,553. When we divide this number by 1.618, we find that letter 2,196 is where the golden ratio is located in this chapter. What is truly astonishing here is that this letter is the last letter of the word gold, Arabic, sahab. So basically the golden ratio here is connected to the word gold. This chapter has 830 words and mentions the word gold, Arabic, sahab, only twice. This is clear evidence that the author connected the golden ratio to gold 1,200 years before the German mathematician Martin Ohm, who coined the term golden ratio. This only shows us that the author of the Quran knew the future, how people would call this divine proportion, so he coded it before they invented it, to be clear evidence that the book comes from the all-knowing God. What you are witnessing here is a visual miracle, which can be seen, tested, and verified by everyone. Here you can see directly in the Quran search program how many letters there are in the chapter, and where the word gold is located in the chapter. It is exactly at the 2,196th letter.
chromosomes of different animals and plants coded in the Quran.
In this part of the video, we delve into the Quran's verses, where chromosomes of animals and plants are hinted at, long before the discovery of chromosomes or the advent of modern science. Join us as we unravel the mysteries of this ancient text, and reflect on the implications it holds for our understanding of divine wisdom and foresight. Prepare to be amazed as we uncover evidence that transcends time and space, providing compelling proof of the Quran's divine origin and the existence of an all-knowing creator. Chapter B is the 16th chapter of the Quran. Science tells us that male bees have 16 chromosomes, while female bees have 2 pairs of 16 chromosomes, totaling 32. Not only does chapter number 16 hint at the chromosomes of male bees, but the only mention of the word bee in verse 68 of this chapter contains 16 letters, from the beginning of the verse to the last letter of the word bee. Furthermore, this whole verse is made up of 16 different letters, out of the 28 Arabic letters. From the beginning of the verse to the last letter of the first occurrence of the word ape in the Quran, there are 48 letters. Apes have 48 chromosomes. From the beginning of the verse to the first letter, in the word horses, there are 64 letters. Science tells us now that horses have 64 chromosomes. From the beginning of the verse to the first letter, in the word camel, there are 74 letters. Science tells us now that horses have 74 chromosomes. From the beginning of the verse to the first letter, in the word locusts, there are 23 letters. Science tells us now that male locusts have 23 chromosomes. From the beginning of the verse to the first letter, in the word leech, there are 14 letters. Science tells us now that leeches medicinales have 14 chromosomes. Even the verse number hints at that, which is 14. What is interesting here is that God talks about human embryological development, and he mentions that humans develop into a leech-like structure during a short period of pregnancy. This leech-like appearance can't be observed with the naked eye without a microscope. You can see the image of how a leech looks like and how an embryo looks like at 25 days of pregnancy. There is a striking similarity. Even Professor Winston compares the embryo to a leech in a documentary called The Human Body: The Incredible Journey from Birth to Death, from 1998. The donkey is mentioned, in singular simple form, only in chapter 62 out of 114 chapters, and donkeys have 62 chromosomes. From the end of verse 176 in chapter 7 to the first letter, in the first word dog in the Quran, there are 78 letters. We know now that dogs have 78 chromosomes. In verse 5:60, after the word pigs, there are 38 letters to the end of the verse. Pigs have 38 chromosomes. Flies are mentioned only in this verse in the Quran. Verse 22:73. The word fly is the 8th word from the end of the verse. Fruit flies have 8 chromosomes. Mosquito is mentioned only in this verse in the Quran. Verse 26. Before the word mosquito, there are 8 words. The mosquito species Shagasia bathana has 8 chromosomes. From the beginning of the story about Adam's sons in chapter 5 to the word crow, there are 80 words. Science tells us that crows have 80 chromosomes. Ginger is only mentioned in verse 76:17, and it is the last word in the verse. This verse has 30 letters. Science says that the number of chromosomes in small ginger and giant ginger is 30 chromosomes. Pomegranates are mentioned in verse 55:68. Before the word pomegranates, there are 14 letters from the beginning of the verse, and the 18th letter is the last letter of pomegranates. Science tells us that pomegranates' chromosomes vary between 14 to 18 chromosomes. In verse 141, after the word pomegranates, there are 18 words to the end of the verse. Pumpkin is only mentioned in the Quran once, in verse 37:146. It is the last word in the verse, which has 22 letters. The fluted pumpkin, Telferia occidentalis, has 22 chromosomes. Now, after we have seen chromosomes of different animals and plants coded in the Quran, let us see how human chromosomes are coded in the Quran. The word sperm drop, referring to a sperm cell, is mentioned most times in chapter 23 out of 114 chapters. In some other chapters, it is mentioned only once, while in this chapter, 23, it is mentioned twice, making it unique among all other chapters. Science tells us that human sperm cells have 23 chromosomes. Sperm drop is mentioned in verse 36:77. From the beginning of the verse to the first letter of sperm drop, Arabic, nutfa, there are 23 letters. So the 23rd letter is the first letter in the word sperm drop. The expression son of Mary, referring to Jesus, in the Quran, is mentioned 23 times. What is interesting here is that Jesus got only 23 chromosomes from his mother, and none from a father, since he had no human father. Just like male bees get 23 chromosomes from the mother and none from their father. Male bees have no father, just like Jesus has no father, so the expression, Son of Mary, mentioned 23 times in the Quran hints at virgin birth, that he got only 23 chromosomes from his mother.
And numerical miracles in the Quran. From the first occurrence of the word son in the Quran to the last occurrence of the word son, there are 5,778 verses. What is interesting now is that this number is the temperature on the surface of the sun, 5,778 Kelvin degrees. The number is so big and so specific that it is unlikely to be pure chance but an intentional coding in the Quran of the temperature of the surface of the sun in a future unit of measurement, which was invented by Lord Kelvin long after the revelation of the Quran. Since researchers have found around 600 numerical patterns in the Quran, the high frequency of numerical patterns in the same book removes the doubt that all of this could be just pure coincidence. So, the high frequency of numerical patterns in a small area, like one single book, rules out the possibility that all of this could be just pure chance. The planet called Kepler 16b orbits two suns. This is the first planet discovered to have two suns, resulting in two sunsets and two sunrises. God informed us about this planet 1400 years ago in the Quran in verse 55:17. He is the Lord of two sunrises and two sunsets. Here are some intriguing observations. The verse talks about double sunsets and sunrises. Kepler 16b is the first discovered planet that has two suns, resulting in two sunsets and two sunrises. From the verse about two sunsets and sunrises, Kepler 16b verse, to the word Earth, there are 245 letters. Kepler 16b is 245 light-years away from the Earth. Before the verse about two sunsets and sunrises, Kepler 16b verse, there are 16 verses, just like the number in the name Kepler 16b. From the only word star to the verse about planet Kepler 16b, there are 229 letters. It takes planet Kepler 16b to orbit its two parent stars in 229 days. The galactic latitude coordinates for Kepler 16b are 17 degrees, 21 minutes, and 58.1 seconds, while the only verse about two sunsets and two sunrises in the Quran, the verse about Kepler, is the 17th verse. It has 21 letters and is preceded by 58 words from the beginning of the chapter to the verse about Kepler. Ask yourself now, could an illiterate prophet Muhammad or any person in the 7th century have known these facts to encode them like this in the Quran? Isn't this enough proof for you that the Quran is the word of God as it claims to be? God says in the Quran, verse 25:45, "Do you not see how your Lord lengthens the shadow? If he had willed, he could have made it stand still. We made the sun its indicator." As we see, the verse talks about shadow and sun, explicitly mentioning the motion of the earth, because the shadow lengthening occurs with the motion of the earth around the sun when the earth rotates around its own axis. This implies the rotation of the earth. Without the earth's rotation, shadows would stand still and not lengthen during the day. Interestingly, the order of this verse in the Quran is 2,900, and we know that the total number of verses in the Quran is 6,236. When we divide 2,900 by 6,236, we get 0.465. This number is exactly the speed of the Earth at the equator latitude, which is 0.465 kilometers per second. God says in the Quran 21:30, "Do not unbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were joined together before we clove them asunder? We made from water every living thing." Will they not then believe? This is the only verse in the Quran which talks about the Big Bang. Not only does it talk about the Big Bang, but when we analyze the text in the original Arabic of the Quran, we see that the expression which explicitly mentions the Big Bang, "were joined together before we clove them asunder," has a numerical value of 1929. That is the year 1929 when the Big Bang was officially confirmed by the astronomer Edwin Hubble. The interesting thing here is that God asks the disbelievers to see what happened in the universe in the past, and that is exactly what we do now when we investigate the universe with modern telescopes like the James Webb Telescope. We look into the past when we observe stars, galaxies, planets, black holes, etc., because of time dilation according to general relativity.
When God swears by something in the Quran, it is often celestial objects such as the sun, moon, and stars. At one place, in verses 81:15-16, he says this, "I swear by what hides, moving and sweeping." Black holes are the only celestial objects that hide, as light can't escape from them, rendering them invisible. They move and sweep their surroundings, sucking in material with their strong gravity. They act like cosmic vacuum cleaners. From the chapter Sun to the verses about black holes, in chapter 81, there are exactly 227 verses. Science tells us today that the Sun moves around the biggest black hole in our galaxy, which is at the center of the galaxy and is called Sagittarius A. It moves with a speed of 227 kilometers per second. This numerical pattern is a clear indication that the verses talk about black holes. The shortest distance, or perigee, between the moon and the earth is remarkably encoded in the Quran. In the chapter, the moon, the words moon and earth are mentioned once each. Using the ChatGPT's calculation, we find that approximately 100.6 moon diameters fit between the moon and the earth during this closest approach. When we measure the distance between the words moon and earth in the chapter, assuming that 3 letters of the Arabic word for moon represent its diameter, we count 308 letters. Dividing this number by the 3 letters representing the moon's diameter in Arabic, we indeed get precisely 100.6, mirroring reality. The distance between the earth and the star Sirius is coded in the Quran. The word Sirius is mentioned once in the Quran. In the chapter, the star, the word star is also mentioned once in the chapter, the star. When we count the letters from the word star to the word earth in this chapter, we see that there are 861 letters. Astronomers say that the distance between Earth and the Sirius binary star system is 8.61 light-years, or 861 centilight-years, matching exactly the number of letters between the word star and the word Earth. What is truly amazing is this: the word Sirius is the 310th word in the chapter, which has 360 words. If we divide 310 by 360, we see that the word Sirius is at 86.11% of the chapter, and we know that Sirius is 8.611 light-years from the Earth. Here we see how the percentage where the word Sirius occurs matches the numbers in light-years from the Earth. From the verse where Sirius is mentioned in this chapter to the end of the chapter, there are 50 words. We now know that the orbital period of the Sirius binary star system is 50 years. The word star in this chapter, where Sirius is mentioned, is the 8th occurrence from the beginning of the Quran. We now know that Sirius is the 8th star system from our solar system. Numerical miracles with the element iron in the Quran. What we have noticed in our research on the numerical miracles of the Quran is that the chapter number is positioned, aiming for the chapter number to have a connection with the name of the chapter. Before we delve into numerical patterns with the element iron in the Quran, we need to examine some examples of how God purposely positioned chapters in the Quran, so that the chapter number is connected in some way to the name of the chapter. Chapter Hud is 11th chapter in the Quran. Story about Hud is told 11 verses, from verse 50 to 60. Chapter People of the Cave is 18th chapter of the Quran. Story about People of the Cave is told in 18 verses, from 9 to 26. Chapter Mary, Mother of Jesus, 19th chapter of the Quran. Story about Mary is told in 19 verses, from verse 16 to 34. Chapter The Table, from which apostles of Jesus ate food from heaven, 5th chapter of the Quran. Story about the table and apostles of Jesus is told in 5 verses, from verse 111 to 115. Chapter Night, 92nd chapter of the Quran. Word night occurs 92 times in the Quran. Chapter Al-Imran, 3rd chapter of the Quran. Imran is mentioned 3 times in the Quran. Chapter Cattle, 6th chapter of the Quran. Cattle mentioned 6 times in chapter Cattle in the Quran. Chapter Isra, 17th chapter of the Quran. During Isra and Miraj, 17 obligatory daily prayer rakats were revealed to Muslims. Chapter B, 16th chapter of the Quran. Male B has 16 chromosomes. Now that we have become acquainted with the fact that the name of the chapter correlates with the sequence number of that chapter, let's see how the chapter iron in the Quran is connected to its sequence. Chapter iron is the 57th chapter in the Quran out of 114 chapters, meaning that the iron chapter is positioned in the center of the Quran, just like the solid iron core in the center of the planet Earth. If we count the number of verses, from the beginning of the Quran to the only verse where iron is mentioned in chapter iron, we find exactly 5,100 verses. Science tells us that from the surface of the Earth to the solid iron core in the center of the Earth, the distance is also exactly 5,100 kilometers. We see here how this big number match between verses and kilometers in this case. From the first occurrence of the word iron in the Quran to the only occurrence of soft iron in the Quran, there are 1,538 verses. Now we know that iron's melting point is 1,538 degrees Celsius. We see here that there are 1,538 verses between hard iron and soft iron, matching obviously iron's melting point, which is 1,538 Celsius degrees. Remember that Celsius degrees were not even invented yet when the Quran came to earth in the 7th century, which makes this a visually clear miracle. The miracle with iron continues from the expression in verse 34:10, where God says, "And we made soft iron for him," to the end of the chapter. There are 2,862 letters. Now we know that the boiling point for iron is 2,862 degrees Celsius. Even the melting point of silver is coded in the Quran in a similar fashion to the melting point of iron. Silver is mentioned only twice with the definite article, the, in the Quran. From the first occurrence to the second occurrence, where silver is mentioned as a tool in hell, that silver will be heated, and those greedy people will be punished with it. For example, those who collected wealth like silver and gold but did not give in charity to the poor, being greedy in this world, that is why they earned the punishment in hell with heated silver. What we can observe here is that from the first occurrence of silver to the second occurrence, where heated silver is mentioned, there are 961 verses, and the melting point for silver is 961 Celsius degrees.
Names of scientists from the West coded in the Quran.
The Quran is a book that talks about future events, like Judgment Day, Paradise, Hell, etc. What is interesting also is that God coded names of scientists from our times numerically and linguistically connected them to their discoveries, which the Quran talks about 1,400 years ago. For example, if the verse speaks about the expansion of the universe, then it is logical that Edwin Hubble's name is coded there, since it was he who confirmed the expansion of the universe in 1929. Let's have a look at some examples with names of scientists, encoded in existing words of the Arabic text of the Quran. In the Arabic alphabet, there is no letter P, so Arabs often substitute it with the letter B. For instance, a word like Pepsi is pronounced as Bebsi in Arabic. Now, knowing this, if we search for Max Planck's name, we find his name as blank, with the letter B. This word blank occurring once in the entire Quran, in the verse 291. The letter N in the word blank is the 6,582nd letter in the chapter. The reduced Planck constant is 6.582, multiplied by 10 to the power of -16. The fact that the only word, blank, referring to Planck, is exactly at the number of the reduced Planck constant, clearly evidence that Max Planck's name is hinted here. To code the name of a scientist from the future, who will have a connection to a universal constant that God created in the beginning, is clear proof that the author of the Quran, who is the all-knowing God, knows the future. Thus, he coded the name of this scientist as evidence and a visual miracle for us, demonstrating that the Quran is indeed a book from God, because no human knows the future. It was big news in 2012 when scientists announced the discovery of the Higgs boson, which is also called the God particle. When we search for the word Higgs in the Quran, we find it represented by the letters Hids, with the letter J in the two words, spread among words, God rewards, in the original text of the Quran. In English Arabic lexicon, Higgs boson is called Hids boson, with letter J. As humans called this particle the God particle, God encoded this boson with the name Hids, along with his name and the word reward. From the end of the chapter to the word Hids in the Quran, there are 1,433 letters. It was the Islamic lunar year 1433 when the Higgs boson was announced to have been discovered. The Islamic lunar year 1433 corresponds to the Gregorian year 2012. The text of the verse speaks about Joseph's brothers coming to Joseph, so he gives them a full measure of charity. We now know that this Higgs boson gives mass to matter, which is also an interesting observation from a linguistic point of view. The verse is 1288. The Higgs boson was measured as the Avatar Higgs boson, with a mass of 128.8 gigaelectronvolt, matching the verse number 1288. The expression, "you cling heavily to the earth," in verse 938, obviously has a connection to gravity, as we cling to the earth due to gravity. The first person who defined gravity was Isaac Newton. In this expression, "you cling heavily to the earth," the word Isaac can be detected as Isaac with the letter Q. The word where Isaac's name is found has a numerical value of 1072. What is also interesting is that between the birth of Muhammad and the birth of Isaac Newton, there are exactly 1072 years. There is only one verse in the Quran that speaks about the expansion of the universe. God says in the verse 51:47, "We have built the sky with might, and indeed it is we who are its expanders." The first person who confirmed that the universe was expanding was astronomer Edwin Hubble. What is really striking here is that Edwin Hubble's name is encoded in the Arabic text of the verse with the letters Edwin Hubble. The coding of Edwin Hubble's name looks like this in the original text. For example, if we would find Arnold Schwarzenegger like this in the text, Schwartz, Arn, Old, Nigger. Even though we will discuss chemical elements coded in the Quran in another part of this video, scientist Copernicus has a chemical element named after him, Copernicium, which is coded in the Quran with the word Copernic. That word can be found in the original text of the Quran in verse 17:60. Read from left to right, Copernic. This verse has 112 letters, while we know that the atomic number of the chemical element Copernicium, named after Nicolaus Copernicus, is 112 in the periodic table. This verse 35 in chapter Light, is the only verse in the Quran which could indicate a light bulb, since it mentions light most times in any verse in the entire Quran. It mentions a lamp inside glass, and it mentions that it gives light even though fire does not touch it. Thomas Alva Edison was the discoverer of the light bulb. We can find the name Thomas and the word Alva in the original Arabic text, if we read it from left to right. The Large Hadron Collider in CERN is one of the greatest scientific achievements in modern-day history. Even though this is not the name of scientists, it has a strong connection to scientists today because many scientists work there. If we search for the word CERN in the Quran, we find it occurs only 6 times, and most times it is mentioned in chapter Moon 4 times. From the end of the Quran to the verse where CERN is mentioned as Arabic, CERN, with the letter S, there are 1,374 verses. The Islamic lunar year 1374 was the year when CERN was established, which is equivalent to the Gregorian year 1954. The general theory of relativity is one of the most popular scientifically confirmed theories in modern-day history. Albert Einstein was the first scientist to come up with this theory, which was proven to be a fact in the 20th century. In the Quran, God mentioned only at 2 places that something ascends to him in 2 different times, one day which is 1,000 years long, and another day which is 50,000 years long. In the theory of relativity, time is not constant everywhere. Time is relative. What is interesting here is that between these 2 verses, there are 1,916 verses, and it was the year 1916 when Albert Einstein officially published his book on the general theory of relativity. We see here how the 1,916 verses match the year 1916 when the book was published by Albert Einstein.
Elements from the periodic table coded in the Quran.
One of the most interesting numerical miracles in the Quran is the coding of international chemical element names in the original text of the Quran, connected to either their atomic mass or atomic number from the periodic table. Some names occur only once in the entire Quran, and they are connected to their atomic number or atomic mass. The codings are done in the following way. As researchers have observed, the name of the chemical element needs to have consonant letters in correct order, either when read from right to left or left to right. Counting must be done from logical start and end points, such as the beginning or ending of the verse, or the beginning or ending of the chapter. We can say that the letters must touch the chemical element word to be considered an intentional numerical pattern. Many chemical elements have been coded in the Quran, but we will present to you some of them. Consonant letters for aluminum can be found here in this verse only in the entire Quran. From the beginning of the verse to the consonant letters of aluminum, there are 13 letters. Aluminum has atomic number 13 in the periodic table. From the end of the verse to the word aluminum, the word aluminum begins between the 26th and 27th word from the end of the verse. Aluminum has an atomic mass of 26.982. This is the first time the word carbon occurs in the Quran, in verse 285. After the letters of carbon to the end of the verse, there are exactly 12 letters, while the atomic mass of carbon is 12 grams per mole. In verse 74, 42, we find the only occurrence of the word calcium in the Quran. After this chapter to the end of the Quran, there are 40 chapters. Calcium has an atomic mass of 40 grams per mole. This is the only time word silicon occurs in the Quran. Verse 26, 200. This is the 28th verse from the end of the chapter. Silicon has atomic mass 28 grams per mole. This is the only time word antimony occurs in the Quran. Verse 51 in chapter 26. Antimony has atomic number 51. Word antimon occur also in verse 25. From the beginning of the verse to the word antimon there are 51 words. This is the only time word bismuth in this format occurs in the Quran. Verse 83 in chapter 15. Bismuth has atomic number 83. This is the only time the word holmium occurs in the Quran, in verse 1244. After this verse to the end of the chapter, there are 67 verses. Holmium has atomic number 67. The chemical element holmium is named after Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. When we add diacritical marks to the skeletal line of the text where the chemical element holmium occurs, we clearly see the word holmium. This is the only time word erbium occurs in the Quran. Verse 16, 92. From the beginning of the verse to the word erbium there are 68 letters. Erbium has atomic number 68 in periodic table. This is the only time word germanium can be detected in the Quran as the word germanium. Verse 1449. After the word germanium to the end of the verse, there are 32 words. Germanium has atomic number 32. Chemical element germanium is named after Germany. Chemical element americium is named after America. We see this word in the Quran as Americanum. Verse 842. From the beginning of the verse, 95th letter is in the word Americanum. Americium has atomic number 95. The chemical element nihonium is named after Japan, as Nihon means Japan in the Japanese language. We see this word occur most times in chapter 2 of the Quran. Surah Al-Baqarah is the 113th chapter from the end of the Quran, and has 286 verses, while nihonium has an atomic number of 113. Just like the chapter is the 113th from the end of the Quran. Additionally, nihonium has an atomic mass of 286, just like chapter 2, has 286 verses. This is the only time word dubnium can be detected in the Quran. Verse 1850. From the beginning of the verse the 105th letter is in the word dubnium. Dubnium has atomic number 105. This is the only time word cadmium can be detected in the Quran. Verse 8, 9. From the beginning of the chapter word cadmium is 112th word, while cadmium has atomic mass 112 gram per mole. Other chemical elements found coded in the Quran are selenium, arsenic, phosphorus, chromium, curium, potassium, tellurium, thallium, hafnium, chlorine, europium, neptunium, plutonium, iodine, indium, beryllium, rubidium, iridium, xenon, cerium, sapernicium, titanium, barium, radon, neon. Other remarkable numerical miracles coded in the Quran. 9/11's prophecy in the Quran. Verses about collapsing buildings hints also on 9/11's attacks. 13 points which prove it is a prophecy. Point 1. The verses are in 9th chapter, that corresponds to 9th month. Point 2. The verses are in 11th part, that corresponds to 11th day. Quran has 30 parts, that corresponds to 30 days in September. Point 3. 109th verse, corresponds to South Tower had 109 indoor floors. Point 4. 110th verse, corresponds to North Tower had 110 indoor floors. Point 5. Verses 109 and 110 are the only verses in that part of the Quran talking about collapsing buildings. Point 6. Building on edge, corresponds to twin towers were on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Point 7. Verses 109 and 110 have a total of 157 letters, corresponds to 157 passengers died in the 2 airplanes, which flew into the North and South Tower. Point 8. 1,343 verses from the beginning of the Quran to the 109th verse, corresponds to 1,343.1 feet from the bottom to the 109th indoor floor in the Twin Towers. Point 9. The word building appears 3 times, corresponds to 3 buildings collapsed in the 9/11's attack in New York. Point 10. Linguistic separation reflects the physical separation between the 3 collapsed buildings. Twin Towers corresponds to mentioning his building 2 times. Third building corresponds to expression, their building. Point 11. Doubt is connected to the building, corresponds to Many doubts now surrounding the events of 9/11. Point 12:19 hijackers corresponds to 19 verses from verse 110 to the end of chapter 9. Point 13, the North Tower had a height of 417 meters, and now the new one, World Trade Center, has a height of 417 meters, corresponds to 417 words from verse 110 to the end of chapter 9. Verses 109 and 110 were revealed due to hypocrites building a false mosque during Prophet Muhammad's time, so God revealed these verses. But we can clearly see that he placed them in the correct places, so the text also corresponds to a future event, in this case, the 9/11 attacks. This provides double information in the same text. Question: why would God include this event in his book? The answer is simple: to show people that he knows the future, that they can witness the miraculous nature of the Quran with their own eyes, and that they can be certain that this is his book, and that what he tells them about the future in that book will happen. God says in the Quran, verse 41:53, we will soon show them our signs in the universe, and in their own souls until it becomes manifest to them that this, the Quran, is the truth. Is it not sufficient as regards your Lord that he is a witness over all things? Verse 21:37, man was created hasty. I will show you my signs soon, so do not ask me to hasten them. So the purpose of prophecies in the Quran is to make people certain that the Quran speaks the truth. The story about the 71 men during Prophet Moses' time is told in 71 words across 2 verses in the Quran, verses 155 and 156 in chapter 7. Pregnancy period of a cow hinted in the number of verses in the chapter. The cow, in the Quran, breeds of cows, Guernsey and Tralee, have pregnancy period of 286 days, while chapter the cow in the Quran has 286 verses. Word Rafiu in Arabic, which means possessor of the highest degrees, occurs only once in the Quran. This is one of the names of God. The word Rafiu is positioned next to the word degrees. What is interesting here is that the word Rafiu has a numerical value of 360. We can clearly see that 360 degrees are intentionally coded here. Water percentage in honey coded in the Quran. Verse 47:15 contains 2 words, water, and 1 word, honey. From the first occurrence of the word water to the word honey, there are 17 words. From the word honey to the second occurrence of the word water in the verse, there are also 17 words. Science tells us that the average percentage of water in honey is 17%. Water percentage in milk coded in the Quran, in verses 65 and 66, in chapter 16. Between the first occurrence of the word milk and the word water, there are 88 letters. Science tells us that cow milk and human milk contain 88% water. Speed of light is coded in the Quran in seconds. After chapter, the sun, if we count 499 words, we will reach the sentence that describes the reality about which God says, you will see it with your eyes certainly. It takes 499 seconds for light to travel from the sun to the earth. This means that we see everything through reflecting light. So in the Quran, after the chapter, the sun, this reality is discussed right after 499 words, beautifully matching the speed of light. Speed of light is coded in the Quran. If we want to see what the 299,792nd letter in the Quran is, a Quran search program shows us that it is the first letter of the word Torah. God says in the Quran that the Torah is the light. We see here clearly that God connects the Torah to light, linguistically and also numerically, by positioning the word Torah to be at the 299,792nd letter, which is the speed of light in kilometers per second. Land-sea ratio in the Quran. The word land in the singular is mentioned 12 times in the Quran, while the word sea in the singular is mentioned 33 times. If we add these two numbers together, we get 45. To find the percentage of water, we divide 33 by 45, resulting in 73.3% water ratio in the Quran. This closely matches the percentage in reality, which is somewhere around 71 to 72%. Last time God mentioned the sea in the Quran was in chapter 82, out of 114 chapters. If we divide 82 by 114, we get 71.9%, which is exactly the percentage in reality, somewhere around 71 and 72%. The land and the sea occur together in 7 verses in the Quran. We now know that there are 7 continents. Human body water percentage coded in the Quran. The word human is mentioned 90 times, while the word water is mentioned 63 times in the Quran. If we divide 63 by 90, we get exactly 70% water, which is what science tells us now, that we have around 70% water in our bodies. Numerical connection between the Svalbard Global Seed Vault and a Quranic verse about future seed and plant production is indeed intriguing. In verse 78:15, God mentions bringing forth seeds and plants. Remarkably, the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is located at coordinates 78 degrees north and 15 degrees east, exactly matching the verse reference. The area covered by these coordinates on Earth is incredibly small, approximately 0.00006%, reinforcing the idea of intentional coding of the vault's location in the Quran. Distance between the Kaaba in Mecca and the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, as encoded in the Quran, is a fascinating revelation. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is mentioned once in verse 17:1, while the first mention of Masjid al-Haram and the Kaaba in Mecca is in verse 9:28. Between these two verses, there are 767 verses. Remarkably, when measuring the distance between the Kaaba and the Al-Aqsa Mosque on Google Earth, it precisely matches 767 miles, as evidenced by the screenshot provided. God challenges humans in the Quran to produce another Quran, or even just one chapter if they doubt its divine origin. God says in the Quran, verses 23-24, "If you have doubts about the revelation we have sent down to our servant, then produce a single chapter like it and list whatever supporters you have other than God if you truly think you can. If you cannot do this and you never will, then beware of the fire prepared for the disbelievers, whose fuel is men and stones." Verse 17:88, say, even if all mankind and jinn came together to produce something like this Quran, they could not produce anything like it, however much they helped each other. Maybe someone might wonder, what is so special, for example, about chapter 111, that it is impossible for humans to create? It's a small chapter with only 5 verses, and we don't see any scientific miracles in it. So what makes it so special, and why is it impossible for us humans to write something like that? God says, "May the hands of Abu Lahab be ruined. May he be ruined too. Neither his wealth nor his gains will help him. He will burn in the flaming fire, and so will his wife, the firewood carrier, with a palm fiber rope around her neck." When we deeply analyze the original text of this chapter in Arabic, we see absolutely stunning numerical coding that makes it impossible for any human to create something like this in their head and recite it without using any help like computers, calculators, paper, and pen. Relying solely on their own mind, you have only one chance to recite it, and there is no editing process. Editing the text would mean not matching the same circumstances during Prophet Muhammad's time, where there was no editing process in the Quranic text. If there were an editing process, it would imply that verses were moved from one chapter to another or that something was added or removed after the revelation, which would mean a person is corrupting the text. When we delve into this chapter, we see that all words with odd positions in the chapter have the same numerical value as all letters with odd positions in the chapter, which is the number 3049, and all even words with even positions have the same numerical value as all letters with even positions, which is the number 2382. No human can keep track in their mind of the position of each letter or word and its numerical value, etc. Now, the question arises, after witnessing all these obvious numerical miracles in the Quran, why did God construct his book like this? What is the purpose of this? Prophet Muhammad said in a hadith, "I have been sent with the shortest expressions bearing the widest meanings." Reference, Sahih al-Bukhari 2977. So, Quranic text can have multiple meanings. There is one verse in the Quran which gives us an answer to what is the purpose of numerical miracles in the Quran. The verses 30 and 31 in chapter 74 state, over it are 19. None other than angels appointed by us to guard hellfire, and we have made their number a test for the disbelievers. So, those who have been given the scripture will be certain, and those who believe will have their faith increased. Neither those who have been given the scripture, nor the believers will have any doubts, but the sick at heart and the disbelievers will say, "What could God mean by this description?" God leaves whoever he will to stray and guides whoever he will. No one knows your Lord's forces except him. This is a warning to mortals. Here we see that the purpose of the number 19, in this case, is to be a test for disbelievers, to challenge them to produce even a chapter like the Quran if they doubt it is from God, so that those who have been given the scripture among Jews and Christians are certain that the Quran comes from God, and Muslim believers get stronger in faith when they see these clear miracles. How can we benefit from these numerical miracles in the Quran? The answer is simple. The purpose of these miracles is to increase faith that the Quran truly comes from God and not from humans. Within these miracles, we have seen how God codes future events before they happen. So when we read the Quran and encounter passages about future events like Judgment Day, Paradise, and Hell, we can be even more certain that they will happen, just as God coded these future events in the Quranic text 1,400 years ago, and we have seen them come to pass in our times. The core purpose of all this is to be certain in God's book, to follow it, so we can attain His paradise and eternal life there, and avoid hell in the hereafter. These numerical miracles are one of the strongest proofs for the existence of God, because it is not logical to assume that all these numerical patterns in the Quran are just coincidences. It's also unreasonable to claim that some smart people did it 1,400 years ago, because we have seen that the author knows the future. We can't assume that humans know the future. That is the quality of God, not humans. Numerical miracles of the Quran are also part of the wisdom for which Prophet Muhammad prayed for Ibn Abbas. Ibn Abbas reported, "The Messenger of Allah, peace and blessings be upon him, put his hand on my shoulder, and said, O Allah, give him understanding in religion and teach him the interpretation of the Quran." Source: Musnad Ahmad 2879. The Prophet prayed not only for knowledge and understanding but also for wisdom. Abdullah related an incident about himself. Once the Prophet, peace be upon him, was about to perform wudu. I hurried to get water ready for him. He was pleased with what I was doing. As he was about to begin prayer, he indicated that I should stand at his side. However, I stood behind him. When the prayer was finished, he turned to me and said, "What prevented you from being at my side? O Abdullah, you are too illustrious and great in my eyes for me to stand side by side with you," I replied, raising his hands to the heavens. The Prophet then prayed, "O Lord, grant him wisdom." The Prophet's prayer was undoubtedly granted, for Abdullah proved time and again that he possessed wisdom beyond his years. Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab often sought his advice on important matters of state and described him as the young man of maturity. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas described him with these words, "I have never seen someone who was quicker in understanding, who had more knowledge and greater wisdom than Ibn Abbas." I have seen Umar summon him to discuss difficult problems in the presence of veterans of Badr from among the Muhajirin and Ansar. Ibn Abbas would speak, and Umar would not disregard what he had to say. These qualities led to Abdullah ibn Abbas being known as the learned man of this ummah. Now, what does this have to do with numerical miracles in the Quran? Ibn Abbas, the first person to investigate numerical miracles in the Quran, analyzed Surah Al-Qadr numerically to find its connection with the 27th night of Ramadan. He used numerical patterns in this surah as evidence that the 27th night of Ramadan is coded as the number 27 in Surah Al-Qadr. Since the Prophet prayed for Ibn Abbas to gain wisdom and a good interpretation of the Quran, wisdom implies a deeper understanding and knowledge to comprehend the essence of the matter. Ibn Abbas was the most knowledgeable in interpreting the Quran after Prophet Muhammad, and he was the one who first delved into numerical miracles in the Quran. Therefore, we can conclude that numerical miracles in the Quran are part of religious wisdom, facilitating a deeper understanding of Quranic texts. Finally, a few words before we end this video. As we mentioned earlier, the purpose of mathematical miracles is to provide clear evidence for us that the book comes from God and not humans, to challenge disbelievers who claim that there is no God, to mathematically prove to us that the Quran is an unchanged and uncorrupted book since the time of revelation, to remove doubts for Jews and Christians that the Quran, as the last revelation from God, is indeed the book from the only true God, the creator of the universe, who constructed this whole universe mathematically with universal constants, the golden ratio, etc. With mathematical miracles, we begin to understand more why God said that doubters should try to create another Quran, or a chapter similar to Quranic chapters, because he knows that it is impossible for humans to do that. God says in the Quran, verse 41:53, "We will soon show them our signs in the universe and in their own souls, until it becomes manifest to them that this, the Quran, is the truth. Is it not sufficient as regards your Lord that he is a witness over all things?" Verse 21:37, "Man was created hasty. I will show you my signs soon, so do not ask me to hasten them." Mathematical miracles in the Quran are the fulfillment of God's promise, showing his signs in the universe and nature that the Quran is his book. God did not put these miracles just to entertain us. This is just the continuity of how he acted with different people, and what was popular for them in their generations. For us, mathematics is the most popular science in our generation, since mathematics is involved in many other sciences, like physics, chemistry, biology, economics, statistics, engineering, etc. So it is logical that God should challenge our generation via mathematics in his book, the Quran, to try to reproduce something like that and to give us certainty that this book is his book. That is why we need to follow the Quran, to gain happiness in this world and succeed in the hereafter, to avoid hell, and for God to let us enter into His paradise. Judgment Day comes after our death, and we need to prepare for that with good deeds, faith, and staying away from evil deeds, being kind to other people, and helping poor people. All these numerical miracles you saw in this video have been confirmed by several researchers. To find all these patterns is the result of more than a decade-long research. We hope you benefit from the video.
حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي